In our headlines on this Thursday afternoon, March 21st, here in South Korea. Junior doctors who continue to defy the government's return to work order will face official license suspension starting next week as their walkout over plans to expand medical school admissions quota persists over a month. Meanwhile, policymakers at the US Federal Reserve are keeping their interest rate between 5.25% and 5.5% for the fifth session in a row, but are also maintaining their projections of 3 rate cuts within the year. And a panel of pundits at the United Nations sound the alarm again over North Korea's illicit access to essential funds for its hostile weapons ambitions through cybercrime, which reportedly amounted to some $3 billion between 2017 and 2023. Junior doctors here engaged in collective action against government plans to expand medical school admissions quota are poised to face tangible repercussions come next week. Our Shin Se-byuk has the latest.
Starting next week, the government will begin suspending the licenses of trainee doctors who have not returned to hospitals. Urging defiant doctors to return to their patient sites, Second Vice Health Minister Park Min-soo issued stern warnings on Thursday, stating they would face consequences otherwise.
Starting next week, the government will enforce license suspensions for doctors who have defied the return-to-work order.
Park also called on new interns who have so far failed to register at hospitals to do so by the end of this month, highlighting that this is necessary for them to advance to becoming residents next year. If the government proceeds with the suspensions, they will take place some 5 weeks after trainee doctors walked out of hospitals en masse, protesting the government's decision to increase medical school admission seats by 2,000 starting next year. The health ministry has issued prior suspension notices to about 5,000 trainee doctors who must submit their responses by next Monday. Following this, the ministry will proceed with issuing formal suspension notices. Thursday's announcement came a day after the Education Ministry announced details on how the additional 2,000 places at medical schools will be allocated. According to the current plan, most seats will be distributed to medical schools outside the capital area to better address the shortage of medical services in rural areas. That figure is 1,639 seats, approximately 82% of the total. Based on the announcement, each university will have its new quotas reflected in its admission announcements for the 2025 academic year, which will be released to students around May. Following the government's announcement, medical school professors, trainee doctors, medical students, and medical associations convened on Wednesday night to strategize their response. The primary focus of the meeting was to discuss when professors from medical schools nationwide might submit their resignation letters. Professors from leading national universities have agreed to resign en masse. However, they have not yet settled on a specific date for taking that step. Professors from Seoul National University and Yonsei University have already marked March 25th as their resignation submission date, while professors at other universities including Ulsan National University and Seonggyun University are still fine-tuning their plans. In the meantime, the government plans to host an open discussion on Thursday afternoon aimed at addressing concerns and improving the conditions of medical residents. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Right. Also on the issue of healthcare, President Yoon Suk-yeol has shared the government's commitment to caring for its senior citizens through public housing and medical support. In a policy briefing on this Thursday, this time in Wonju City in Gangwon-do Province, he pledged 3,000 public homes annually for the less fortunate elderly. Silver Stay, a senior living project that includes comprehensive services, was also announced. As for medical support, he vowed to expand at-home medical care, raising the number of long-term home visit centers to 250 nationwide. Curtains went down on the third Summit for Democracy Wednesday evening Korea time with a virtual plenary session of global leaders during which President Yoon Suk-yeol called for collaboration in defending democracy from disinformation amid a record number of elections this year worldwide. Our senior correspondent Oh Soo-young covers his remarks.
President Yoon has called on the free world to create joint high-tech countermeasures against fake news and the misuse of digital technology to prevent these from threatening democracy. During the third Summit for Democracy hosted by South Korea, Yoon opened a virtual plenary session of 36 world leaders on Wednesday local time, co-chairing the session with Denmark and Kenya. As more than 60 countries representing half of the world's 8 billion people hold elections this year, Yoon focused on artificial intelligence, elections and fake news, underscoring the need to protect electoral integrity as the foundation of democracy.
특정 세력들이 조직적으로 제작하고 배포하는 가짜 뉴스는 단순히 잘못된 정보를 전파하는 것을 넘어 사회적 갈등과 분열을 야기합니다. 또한 가짜 뉴스는 국민들이 사실과 다른 정보를 바탕으로 잘못된 판단을 내리도록 선동함으로써 민주주의 근간인 선거를 위협하고 있습니다. 이는 민주주의에 대한 분명한 도발입니다.
As societies become more and more exposed and susceptible to AI-generated content on online platforms, heavily curated with algorithms, the South Korean leader said democratic countries should jointly develop AI and digital systems to detect and eradicate forces that utilize the same technologies to generate fake news. This requires solidarity and the sharing of technology, he said, adding that the international community must also stand together to enforce measures against foreign intervention in elections. Joining the conversation, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said the use of deepfakes and audio created by AI undermines people's rights to make their own political choices, making society become unstable and divided. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres added the world must build guardrails for artificial intelligence and the digital world.
The summit's theme, Democracy for Future Generations, reminds us of an additional essential responsibility. We must strengthen democratic systems and institutions for and with the world's 1.8 billion young people and for the generations to follow.
Noting that democracy spurs creativity and innovation by empowering individuals, the leaders also emphasized the need to build inclusive practices and capacity for democratic governance, especially in the global south. South Korea on Thursday released a summary of key opinions shared throughout the summit. These include the potential for using advanced technologies to enhance democracy, such as by widening channels for political participation, as well as the inclusion of young people, women, and social minorities. They also agreed on the need to strengthen laws and measures to mitigate the risks that new technologies pose to privacy and electoral integrity, and agreed with Yoon's call to strengthen cooperation on technology to counter such threats. Emphasising that advancing democracy takes collective effort beyond those made by a single country, President Yoon said that Seoul will collaborate with other governments, international organisations and private actors as well to strengthen and expand democratic solidarity based on shared universal values. Oseong, Arirang News.
On the local political front, candidate registration for the April parliamentary election is underway, and political parties have shared their key commitments for the 22nd National Assembly. Our correspondent Shin Ha-young reports.
Candidate registration for South Korea's general election has begun. It will run for 2 days starting today from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Personal details including asset declarations, military service status, and criminal records of registered candidates will be publicly available through the National Election Commission's website. Both the ruling and main opposition parties last week each announced their 10 key pledges for the next 4 years with a shared emphasis on tackling the country's low birth rate. The People Power Party outlined its key pledges, focusing on 3 primary agendas: addressing the low birth rate, narrowing the widening wealth gap, and addressing climate change. The Democratic Party's commitments are centered around 4 major objectives: enhancing people's livelihoods, providing hope for the future, protecting democracy, and fostering peace. The party's focus lies in extending financial assistance to newlywed couples, such as providing public rental housing to couples with more than 1 child. Cities with major chipmakers plants, including SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics in Gyeonggi-do Province, known as the Semiconductor Belt, are emerging as pivotal swing regions. Parties have been announcing chip-related pledges and nominating influential candidates in these areas. The ruling party pledged full support for the government's plan to create a mega chip cluster in Gyeonggi-do province by 2047 and simplify the process for chip development and investment permits.
The semiconductor belt is essentially a creation of the People Power Party. We are the ruling party, and President Yoon has made a lot of diplomatic efforts regarding semiconductor issues.
Meanwhile, the main opposition party has committed to creating an ecosystem for a semiconductor powerhouse through regulatory reforms and tax incentives. These include extending the tax deduction deadline for investments in national strategic technologies and establishing so-called semiconductor megacities in the southern and eastern regions of Gyeonggi-do province.
The semiconductor industry is the key engine for South Korea's economy. With the increasing significance of chips, competition is escalating, transforming into a national-level competition.
After the two-day registration period, candidates can run their official election campaign from next Thursday until April 9, the day before the general election. 신하영, Arirang News.
The head of U.S. Forces Korea, General Paul LaCamera, has highlighted the importance of maintaining U.S. troops here in South Korea. Remarks to the Senate were shared on Wednesday during a hearing at the House Armed Services Committee in Washington. They also follow concerns over the fate of the 28,500 American servicemen and women stationed here in the country in the event of a potential shift in U.S. leadership following November's presidential election. General LaCamera called for the need to continue competing, quote, in the gray zone with North Korea amid its weapons ambitions, and also made note of the fact that China and Russia were, quote, mindful of U.S. presence in the region. Meanwhile, a panel of pundits at the United Nations have sounded the alarm yet again over North Korea's rampant access to essential funds for its hostile weapons ambitions through cyber crime. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
The UN Security Council Sanctions Committee on North Korea on Wednesday released its biannual report, which included details of military and political tensions on the Korean Peninsula over the 6 months from July 2023 to January 2024. The report said that not only have tensions on the Korean Peninsula heightened, but that according to a panel of experts, North Korea obtained half of its total foreign currency income through financial theft via hacking and cyber attacks. They added that such funds were obtained to cover 40% of the resources needed for developing weapons of mass destruction. The report says while there hasn't been a 7th nuclear test, the regime has been developing additional nuclear weapons and producing fissile materials to avoid UNSC sanctions. The panel pointed out that the continuous cyber attacks targeting the virtual asset industry is also a means of generating revenue by avoiding UNSC sanctions. As the crippling sanctions made it nearly impossible to obtain foreign currency needed to develop nuclear weapons and other missile technologies, hacking is used as the main means of earning such income. The report stated that it's currently investigating 17 cases of virtual currency theft last year in which North Korea was suspected to have been involved. The total amount stolen through such means amounts to $750 million. When looking at the amount stolen by North Korean hacking organizations between 2017 and 2023, the figure is a staggering $3 billion. The report also said the possibility of a technology transfer between Pyongyang and Moscow, which further fuels the regime's continued nuclear weapons development, is currently being investigated. The Sanctions Committee inspects the implementation of the international community's UNSC sanction against North Korea and reports the results of its activities to the UN twice a year. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
U.S. monetary policymakers have decided to maintain their interest rates at current levels for the time being. Our economics correspondent Lee Soo-jin covers this decision and its broader implications for the Bank of Korea.
U.S. Federal Reserve officials kept rates unchanged for the 5th consecutive time on Wednesday, following the second two-day Federal Open Market Committee meeting this year. With this latest move, the benchmark interest rates in the U.S. continue to stand in the range of 5.25% to 5.5%. And the key interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. remains at 2 percentage points, as the Bank of Korea also froze its rates for the 9th consecutive meeting in February. The U.S. Fed's decision to once again freeze interest rates, along with South Korea's consumer prices once again entering 3% territory last month, is increasing the likelihood of the Bank of Korea also keeping rates steady at the current rate of 3.5% at next month's decision rate meeting. There has been much speculation about when the Fed will begin cutting interest rates, with observers forecasting that rate cuts will come in the second half of the year. Following this latest meeting, policymakers forecast that 3 rate cuts will come by the end of the year, consistent with earlier forecasts and supported by the Fed chairman's comments.
We believe that our policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle, and that if the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year.
A fresh set of quarterly U.S. economic estimates has also been released, showing an elevated projection for inflation due to slower than expected progress towards the Fed's 2% target. The forecast says the personal consumption expenditures price index, excluding food and energy, will rise at a rate of 2.6% by the end of the year, compared to the 2.4% projection issued in December. And during Thursday's emergency macroeconomic meeting in South Korea, attended by the country's key economic leaders to discuss the potential impact of the U.S. Fed's rate freeze, Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok said that there is growing uncertainty about the timing of rate cuts in other countries, especially with the Bank of Japan's decision earlier this week to raise interest rates for the first time in 17 years. 이수진, Arirang News.
In other news, former crypto entrepreneur Kwon Do-hyung will be facing a South Korean court on charges of fraud for which he may spend decades behind bars, our Yoon reports.
The Montenegrin Court of Appeals finalized on Wednesday the extradition of Do Kwon to his home country, South Korea. In a statement on its website, the court said that it had rejected an appeal by Kwon's legal representatives and upheld a decision by the country's high court on March 6th to hand over Kwon to South Korea rather than to the United States. The Court of Appeals assessed that the first instance court correctly determined that the request for Kwon to be extradited to South Korea arrived before the U.S. one. This verdict means the case is now closed regarding the country that Kwon will be extradited to. The Montenegrin Ministry of Justice will now set the exact date for his extradition. According to Bloomberg, that could take place as early as this weekend, when his prison sentence in Montenegro for using forged documents comes to an end. Kwon was captured at an airport in Montenegro in March of 2023 as he attempted to board a private flight to the United Arab Emirates on a forged passport. After remaining in custody from the time of his arrest, he was sentenced to 4 months in prison in June of last year. An appeal against that ruling was rejected by a higher court, and the sentence began in November. Kwon faces prosecution for several criminal charges in South Korea and the U.S. South Korean prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for Kwon over allegations related to the crash of Terra USD and Luna coins in May 2022, which it's estimated wiped out nearly $37 billion in market value. Kwon is also wanted in the U.S., where he was charged with fraud by federal prosecutors in New York. Interpol also issued a red notice for Kwon, which is used for the highest level of wanted suspects and criminals. 이은진, Arirang News.
On the trade front, Korea's Ramyeon exports hit a fresh high last month. According to the Korea Customs Service on Thursday, the total value of Ramyeon exports in February amounted to $93 million, up over 31% on year, breaking a previous record set in November last year. Given this latest finding, pundits believe ramen exports are on track to surpassing $1 billion for the first time by the year's end. In baseball news, these Los Angeles Dodgers beat the San Diego Padres by 5 runs to 2 here in Seoul Wednesday evening to kick off the opening match of this year's Major League Baseball. Japanese player Shohei Ohtani staged his much-anticipated debut with a comeback win for the Dodgers. Now, some 16,000 fans were on site at Kochok Skydome to watch Korea's first hosting of an MLB regular season game. A second face-off between the two teams is scheduled for this Thursday evening at the same stadium.
Let's take a look at the latest news in the world now. On Wednesday, Ireland's Taoiseach Leo Varadkar announced his resignation as Prime Minister and leader of the ruling Fine Gael party. He quoted personal and political reasons for his surprise move. Speaking at a press conference in Dublin, 45-year-old Varadkar said that he no longer feels fit for leadership and that the time is now to pass on the baton. He added that his time as the country's leader was the most fulfilling of his life. While Varadkar's resignation as head of the three-party coalition government does not trigger a general election, he said he asked for a successor to be elected before Fine Gael's annual conference on April 6th. The elected party leader will then be subject to a vote in Parliament before he or she is appointed as the Prime Minister. Leo Varadkar was Ireland's youngest Prime Minister when he became Fine Gael party leader at 38 in 2017. He is also the first openly gay Irish leader. The European Commission proposed on Wednesday a plan to transfer profits generated from frozen Russian assets in Europe to Ukraine. This would mean that most of some $3 billion of annual profit from the frozen Russian central bank assets would be spent on the Ukrainian military. Currently, there are about $230 billion of frozen Russian central bank assets held in various currencies across the European Union. The exact amount of profit each year depends on global interest rates. Under the EU plan, 90% of the funds taken from Russia would be used to buy weapons for Ukraine, while rest would be used for recovery and reconstruction. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell met with Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, after which he urged member states to approve the plan quickly. Shmyhal said that Ukraine expected the EU and G7 countries to confiscate the original Russian capital itself. Moscow said on the same day that the measure is banditry and theft that would destroy Europe's reliable reputation of safeguarding financial and property rights. According to the latest World Happiness Report released on Wednesday, Finland remains the happiest country in the world for the 7th year in a row. The World Happiness Report, produced as part of the United Nations Global Initiative, measures the absence of corruption, freedom, generosity, health, income and social support to determine a country's national happiness. Nordic nations Denmark, Iceland and Sweden were just below the top spot. Afghanistan and Lebanon were at the bottom of the list. Kim Seong, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. We had a colder start than Wednesday, but with less wind, it made it more bearable. Afternoon highs should go up higher than Wednesday, but still hovering below the seasonal norms. It was a colder morning for mountainous regions, so there is a big gap in ratings in most places. Do dress accordingly. It's always better to feel a little warmer. Meanwhile, nearly 25 centimeters of snow fell in mountainous regions in Gangwon-do yesterday, which helped to ease the dryness in the air. But the rest of the east is still under a dry weather advisory, while the east of Seoul is under a dry advisory for the first time this season. Then highs in Seoul will be topping out at 11 degrees. Daejeon, Jeju make it to 12 degrees Celsius this afternoon. It should not be as windy as yesterday under sunny skies nationwide throughout the day today. Then more rain is in the forecast across Korea for the next 5 days, but it will get much warmer towards Sunday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And that wraps up our Thursday afternoon newscast. We have our daily panel session coming up right after this break, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.
제주도에 처음에 놀러 갔을 때 새롭게 단장했다고 얘기하기로 나와봤는데
할게요. 스트릿 사진 한 장이었는데 혼자서 좋은 건축을
한국인들만의 마음들이 같이 갈래요?
Lotte takes a new leap beyond its boundaries. Our change will lead to better lives for all. New Lotte, the power of a better world. New today, better tomorrow. Lotte.
Welcome. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라 감당할 수 있겠니? 웰컴. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
President Yoon Suk-yeol co-chaired a virtual summit of world leaders Wednesday evening Korea time to promote protection of democratic systems against the threat of disinformation driven by artificial intelligence under the Third Summit for Democracy, which Seoul played host to from this past Monday. Welcome to Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min San-hee. The Third Summit for Democracy came to a close late Wednesday evening local time with the leaders' plenary session co-chaired by the presidents of South Korea, Kenya and Denmark. For more on this, I have Professor Kim Jae-chun at Seogang University live on the line. Professor Kim, welcome.
It's good to be here.
I also have Jessica Stone at the VOA joining us virtually. Jessica, it's a pleasure.
Hello.
Right, Jessica, let's begin then with perhaps a rundown of the key issues addressed during the third virtual summit for democracy.
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with the theme here. The focus of this was on misinformation and disinformation, particularly how it's exacerbated and spread more widely through technology. And so Secretary of State Antony Blinken talked about how technology innovation needs to support but not thwart democracy. He defines democracy as something inclusive and respectful of human rights. And we know that in a 2023 State Department report that China has been spending extra money on propaganda throughout Western countries, particularly through news outlets, when it comes to elections. And this is a big election year, as you pointed out earlier. We have more than half of the world's countries going to election. We've seen incidents of disinformation and misinformation in countries around the world during those elections. And the State Department is releasing guidance, actually, for technology companies to help prevent online attacks against human rights activists. And we also saw recently that the U.S. Treasury Department actually launched its first set of sanctions in connection with spyware used to target U.S. activists and journalists. So we're seeing a groundswell of support for this whole theme, and it's an important time to have this discussion.
Right. And Professor Kim, what was your takeaway from this particular summit?
Well, we'll have to understand the context or backdrop against which this democracy summit was inaugurated. In past several years, democracy has been on the defensive. I mean, it's no secret. The number of democratic countries has decreased. So you see fewer democratic countries in the world. Say, 10 years ago, democracy was proliferating. And the quality of democracy has deteriorated as well in democratic countries, maybe because of the surge of extreme populist movements. I think this is a worrying situation. And authoritarian countries are posing significant challenge to this rules-based liberal international order, this international order in which democracy and human rights are respected. So against this backdrop, democratic countries are now trying to sort of come together and to create a unified front against threats posed by authoritarian countries. That, I think, is the most important takeaway. From the perspective of South Korea, another major takeaway is that South Korea, probably as the most dynamic democracy in Asia, is taking a leading role in such endeavor.
Right. Jessica, what's been the response to this latest virtual summit for democracy among pundits there in the U.S.?
Well, it's just wrapped up, so we're still getting some of that information. We don't have a lot of it just yet, but in the past we have had activists argue that, look, my country is a democracy, even if it's run by an autocrat, and so there were countries who wanted to be included that haven't. Hungary is an example of that. And the list of invitees has also been controversial because there's also this thought that maybe these summits don't push democracies far enough to defend their democracies against authoritarian forces in their own countries. And the invite list has also angered countries like China with respect to the invitation for Taiwan. So those are the historic gripes about this, but we haven't had a lot of reaction here from the United States just yet.
Right, we're still waiting for that response then. And Professor Kim, as Jessica just mentioned, Beijing did take issue with Seoul's invitation of Taiwanese Digital Minister Audrey Tang to address the gathering on the first day. How do you respond to this conflict?
Well, as far as I know, invitation to this democracy summit is not limited to states, state actors, which means that you can also extend invitation to NGOs and other political entities. So in my personal opinion, inviting Taiwanese minister is not really in conflict with one China policy. And South Korea made it clear a number of times, actually, that we respect one China policy. Nonetheless, China was very critical of our decision, as you said. China said that South Korea would eventually burn and collapse if Korea pursues this avenue. I think China's response was a bit too harsh. As I said, we respect one China policy, but that said, as a leading democracy, leading democratic country in Asia, we care about democracy in Taiwan. If China tries to change the status quo in Taiwan with the force unilaterally, we made it clear. President Yoon made it very clear that South Korea is strongly opposed to it. When democracy was being oppressed in Hong Kong by China years ago, many South Koreans were rooting for democratic protesters in Hong Kong. So likewise, we'll be rooting for Taiwan's democracy if it is suppressed by authoritarian regime in China.
Right. Now, beyond the summit itself, but staying with the idea of democracy, Jessica, a number of U.S. media outlets have been touching upon the fate of America's democracy this year. Now, some of these stories, they date back years, 3 years or so. Speaking as a member of the American media, Jessica, what are your thoughts regarding the state of democracy in the U.S. as it looks to host the November presidential election?
Well, look, we are in the fire here in the United States with respect to the impact of artificial intelligence and technology on misinformation and disinformation on democratic institutions in the United States. We've already seen evidence, a very prolific case that's going on in the courts right now of artificial intelligence misleading voters. There was that case in New Hampshire where a political operative organized, literally hired a magician on the streets of New Orleans to read a robocall sounding then like the voice of President Joe Biden through artificial intelligence, asking voters not to go to the polls back in the New Hampshire primary. Well, those voters have now launched a lawsuit against the person who created that call, as well as two of the companies who disseminated it. They're asking for $7,500 per call. So hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages that they're asking for. And that is going to be really closely followed as an example of the dangers of all this. This man has said that, I did this as a wake-up call to the United States, that democracy is endangered by this type of technology. But we do have a political polarization problem in the United States, as we do in much of the world. A 2021 NYU report showing that social media doesn't create that polarization, but it does make it worse. So we're living in a time where we've got technology, we've got social media, specifically AI, changing the game. And we also know that a 2023 PRRI survey shows that nearly a quarter of Americans are now okay with political violence going into this 2024 presidential election. 3/4 of them believe that democracy is at risk. So these are why these important questions are raised. And certainly we are seeing a lot of confirmation that there are serious questions about how this technology will impact the U.S. democratic process going forward into the fall.
Right, indeed. And Professor Kim, for the sake of some comparison, perhaps, what can you tell us about democracy here in South Korea as we speak?
Yeah, as with many other democratic countries, including the United States, there is a lot to be desired in South Korea's democracy. For one thing, parties on politics is way too polarized. I think it's a similar situation in the U.S., as Jessica just mentioned. There's a saying that politics stops at the water's edge. which means that when it comes to foreign policy making, you put aside partisan politics and cooperate with each other for national interests, not for your parochial partisan interests. But that bipartisanship in foreign policy, I think, is a thing of the past in Korean politics. Foreign policy and security policy fell victims to partisan politics, partisan polarization. That said, I think South Korea's democracy is still very healthy. Comparatively speaking, think about the last presidential election. It was a very, very close election. Current President Yoon won the election by 0.7 percentage points. But the opposition party wasted no time and gave a concession speech. No one really challenged the integrity and veracity of the election outcomes, which I think was a testament to the fact that South Korea's democracy is quite mature.
Right, indeed. Going back to the Summit for Democracy, Jessica, quite a number of pundits have cast doubt on the future of this particular platform in the event of a potential shift in U.S. leadership following the November presidential election. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly this was the brainchild of President Joe Biden. And so if he loses re-election in the fall, it's unlikely that we'll see this go forward. This was a campaign promise that he made and has now made good on by holding this. And so we don't know that the future of the summit will go on under a President Donald Trump. But it is worth noting a criticism of the way that this summit is created. A political theorist from Yale University in Foreign Policy magazine noted that the first summit only included elite, educated, wealthy, older leaders. And so by definition, it is missing the populist sentiment and the blind spot that much of the world had around the rise of populism in the world since 2016. And of course, that is certainly embodied in the presidency of Donald Trump and in the campaign of Donald Trump going into the fall.
And Professor Kim, staying with this hypothetical scenario, how does a potential shift at the White House following the November presidential election in the U.S. look to perhaps affect security concerns here on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, if Mr. Trump goes back to the White House, we worry that he may do some damage to ROK-U.S. alliance because in previous term, he tried to suspend and even cancel altogether this, ROK-U.S. joint military drills. And also, he was very skeptical of large American troop presence in South Korea. So we worry that he might try to withdraw USFK from South Korea, which doesn't really bode well for the future of alliance and doesn't really bode well for the security on the Korean Peninsula. But that being said, I think the alliance will remain intact because there is a very strong constituency for the alliance in Congress, in policymaking circle, in military, in businesses, and think tanks, not just in South Korea, but in the U.S. as well. So I believe there will be a limit to which Mr. Trump will do damage to the alliance. There is also a worry that Mr. Trump might hold another ill-conceived summit with Kim Jong-un. But I don't think another summit is likely because, for one thing, Kim Jong-un isn't really interested in another summit with Trump, given the insult that he received in Hanoi summit in 2019.
Right, and staying with all this, Jessica, what do you believe may be down the road for Seoul-Washington ties under a continued Biden administration and as well as a potential Trump administration?
Well, look, it's no secret that these two candidates have incredibly different approaches to foreign policy. President Biden has reinstituted most, if not all, of the alliances around the world, deepening stability, particularly in Asia, through alliances and strengthening them with not only South Korea, but with the Philippines, with some of the Pacific Islands, with Japan, and seeking not only to have stronger alliances between Washington and the region, but in the region. You think of the Japan-Korea alliance encouragement that Washington has imposed, really in the interests of countering China and North Korea. As for Trump, we do know, of course, that he's not a fan of a lot of alliances, that he's had a more unilateral or bilateral approach, I should say, to foreign policy. And he has raised questions about increasing the cost of cost sharing for U.S. troops in South Korea. And of course, after those conversations, South Korea has raised its share of the cost for the U.S. troops in South Korea. And we know that, as the professor mentioned, President Trump did suspend military drills between South Korea and the United States, and also threatened to remove that THAAD missile system. So it is a very different vision for U.S.-South Korea relations, depending on who wins the White House, that is certain. But as the professor also noted, there are more alliances that have been deepened, more pressures coming from the region in particular, asking for U.S. leadership in this part of the world and for U.S. engagement in this part of the world. And so I can certainly understand his hopes from the region that will bear pressure on the White House should Mr. Trump win the White House again.
Right. And Professor Kim, expanding on something that Jessica has just touched upon, this is an impromptu question, but there has been quite a bit of question, that is, on the fate of the 28,500 American soldiers currently stationed in South Korea in the event of a change in American leadership. That being said, Professor Kim, what do you suppose would be the broader implications of perhaps an absence of American soldiers from this part of the world, that is, of course, South Korea?
Well, there is very little doubt that there's going to be a vacuum in South Korea's security. We all know that large troop presence of the United States, USFK, on South Korean soil has been an important deterrent force against North Korea's attempt to launch Second Korean War. So removal of American troop presence, American troops from the South Korean soil will impart a very wrong signal to Mr. Kim Jong-un, in which case he might be very tempted to launch another war on the Korean Peninsula. And early this year, he scrapped a very long time unification policy, North Korean version of unification policy, and redefined inter-Korean relations as the relationship between two hostile countries. So now, as a lot of experts expected, there is a high likelihood of, if not war, major military conflicts on the Korean Peninsula. So removal of USFK, I worry, might send a wrong signal to North Korean leadership.
Right.
And Sunny, can I just pick up on that point?
Right, of course, Jessica, go ahead.
From the U.S. perspective, particularly from the Pentagon's perspective, those troops are essential to all of the contingency planning going into what they believe is going to be a 2027 potential invasion of Taiwan. So we've got the plussing up of troops and weapons and strategic information coming out of the Philippines. There's that radar that they're installing in the island of Palau. All of these contingencies are made better and made stronger in terms of a response to a Taiwan invasion by the presence of those troops on the Korean Peninsula. So it's not, for the United States, of course, it's not just about defending its allies in the region against the threat of a nuclear North Korea. It's also about planning for other contingencies. And so to the extent that the White House listens to the Pentagon, which of course it does not always do, there will be a lot of pressure coming from the Pentagon with that, in that regard.
Right, I see. All right, then let's end with one more question back on the Summit for Democracy. Professor Kim, what do you propose to make this particular summit a permanent platform, perhaps, for some tangible action to advance democratic values?
Well, as I said, democracy is under the threat of authoritarian countries, but it is also faced with a host of challenges associated with technological developments. So democracies, I think, should collectively envision a future of technology that can align with democratic values, openness, and human rights. And when democratic countries can work together to establish guidelines and principles for the ethical and rights-respecting use of AI, artificial intelligence, Democracy Summit I believe can morph into a more robust, if not permanent, more robust platform to protect and promote democratic values.
Right. All right then, Professor Kim, that's all the time we have for this edition. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Jessica, thank you very much for your insights.
Good to be with you, Sunny.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.
So, you want a special experience?